Part 1. Constitutional Background. It can be said that the constitutional history of Kentucky began with its creation as a county in the Commonwealth of Virginia in 1776. Status as a Virginia county never quite satisfied the Kentuckians, of course. For one thing, the distance to the Virginia capital, first Williamsburg and later Richmond, was great and travel was hazardous for anyone going there for business, legislation, or court appeals. Perhaps as importantly, the laws passed by the Mother Commonwealth applicable to Kentucky were objectionable to many of the population. These objections ranged from apprehension over the validity of land grants and titles to disapproval of the regulation of the use of militia against the Indians. Local militia units could be used defensively, but not offensively against the Indians outside of Kentucky, without the approval of the governor of Virginia. Yet another element of the controversy with Virginia was economic. The economic prosperity of Kentucky required access to the Spanish-controlled market in New Orleans. Virginia's economic interests lay elsewhere. These differences would not have been so significant had the population of the Kentucky Territory not grown so dramatically. In spite of long distances and the aggravation of slow and hazardous travel, the population in Kentucky increased rapidly. Coincidental with the influx of more people into Kentucky was an increased frequency of Indian raids by both southern and northern tribes. This increased activity was probably one of the major factors which led to Colonel Benjamin Logan's calling the first of a series of so-called constitutional conventions. The first call for a constitutional convention called for delegates to meet in Danville on December 27, 1784. Altogether, there were 9 such conventions between 1784 and 1790. At these conventions a certain amount of basic work leading toward a constitution was accomplished. Among topics considered were such matters as the need for protection from Indian raids, requests for permission to separate from Virginia, and the desirability of joining the Confederation of the states created by the Articles of Confederation. Grievances with the Virginia authorities, the status of Kentucky's economy, and the inequities of the tax system of Virginia were discussed. There was even some discussion of and support for the scheme of the infamous James Wilkinson to separate Kentucky from both Virginia and the Confederation. Wilkinson's goal of having Kentucky become a ward of Spain was based on Spanish control of the mouth of the Mississippi, which at that time was the most feasible outlet for Kentucky's marketable products. The 10th Constitutional Convention convened in Danville in April 1792. The session lasted only 14 working days, but the delegates drafted Kentucky's first constitution and submitted it to the United States Congress. Congress accepted the Constitution, and on June 1, 1792, Kentucky was admitted to the Union as the 15th state. That so much was accomplished in such a brief period at the 10th convention was because the previous 9 conventions had worked out so many of the difficult problems being considered for inclusion in the Constitution. The document which the convention drafted included a number of relatively new and progressive features. 2 such features were the provisions which called for conducting all elections by ballot rather than by the widely used voice vote of the times, and the basing of representation of both houses of the General Assembly on population rather than geography. The institution of slavery was recognized by Kentucky's first constitution, and the General Assembly was given no power to pass laws for the emancipation of slaves without the consent of their owners or without compensation. However, the General Assembly was authorized to phase out the institution of slavery through regulation of slaves brought into the state as merchandise and through laws enacted to protect slaves and treat them with humanity. In summary, Kentucky's first constitution provided a broad foundation for state government and authorized the General Assembly to enact detailed laws for its administration. Further, the need for future revision of the Constitution was recognized, and provision was made for taking a vote of the people 5 years later to determine if a majority wanted another constitutional convention to be held. Most political scientists agree that a state constitution, when modeled after the United States Constitution, should provide a broad framework of government, one which is divided into 3 coordinate branches, and with authority granted to the legislative branch to make necessary changes through legislation to conform with changing needs and population growth. A broadly written state constitution should be difficult to amend. On the other hand, a state constitution that is lengthy and detailed, and actually writes legislation rather than merely providing the necessary authority for it, should be relatively easy to amend.
The Constitution of 1799. After being approved by the voters of Kentucky, the Second Constitutional Convention was held in 1799, in Frankfort. It took only 27 days to draft the Second Constitution of the Commonwealth. The debates revealed deep political and economic perceptions. There were several significant changes provided by the Second Constitution. It provided for the direct election of governors and senators by the voters rather than by electors, as was required in presidential elections. It also added a lieutenant governor to the list of elected constitutional officers. The original Constitution provided for appointment of judges for life terms, but judges could be impeached or removed by the governor if 2/3 of the General Assembly voted to do so. Under the 1799 document, the governor continued to appoint judges and, in addition, was granted the power to appoint local officials, many of whom had been elected previously. Sheriffs, surveyors, coroners, and justices of the peace were to be appointed by the governor on recommendation of the county courts. Both of these provisions increased the power of the chief executive. Other changes made by the 1799 Constitution included increasing the number of state representatives from 40 to a minimum of 58 but not more than 100 as the population grew, and the number of state senators from a minimum of 11 to a minimum of 24, with one new senator being added in the future for every 3 new representatives. In addition to changing the method of electing the governor, the 1799 Constitution also provided that a governor could not succeed himself in office for 7 years. In addition, the Court of Appeals was deprived of its original jurisdiction in land cases, leaving it with mainly appellate jurisdiction over lower court rulings. Neither of the first 2 constitutions of Kentucky required that a referendum be submitted to the people for their ratification, nor was there any provision for amending these basic documents. In fact, under the Second Constitution, the calling of a constitutional convention was made difficult by the omission of the clause of the First Constitution which had permitted the General Assembly to convene a constitutional convention by a 2/3 vote, notwithstanding an unfavorable popular vote. In another regressive step, voting by voice vote replaced the voting by ballot that had been one of the very progressive features of the First Constitution. The provisions regarding slavery were almost identical to those in the earlier document. In the 3 decades which followed adoption of the 1799 Constitution, many Kentucky voters became dissatisfied with several provisions in the document. One of the major concerns was the appointment of so many officials by the governor. There were allegations of nepotism and even charges of outright sales of appointive offices. Because of these charges and the influence of the Jacksonian philosophy, many voters preferred to make all public offices, even judicial ones, elective. Another public concern regarding the 1799 Constitution related to the state's floating debt and the lack of a sinking fund for its liquidation. The General Assembly was criticized for its lengthy sessions, and there were demands for constitutional restraints on dueling, as well as criticism of the widespread illiteracy in the Commonwealth. Pro-slavery forces in the Commonwealth desired greater protection for slave property during this period. In other regions of the state, especially those increasing in population, there were demands for more equitable apportionment of legislative seats.
The Constitution of 1850. As early as 1828, demands for another constitutional convention were heard in the General Assembly. It was 10 years later that the General Assembly passed an act for a statewide referendum to determine the will of the people regarding the calling of a convention. Although that effort failed, sentiment for change continued. This movement finally culminated in 1847 and 1848, with the proposed call for a convention being submitted to the voters and approved by more than a 2-to-1 majority. The Constitutional Convention convened in Frankfort on October 1, 1849, and remained in session until December 21, 1849. The constitutional debates were quite extensive. The written proceedings of this convention, covering 1,129 pages of small type, resulted in a number of significant changes in the fundamental law of the Commonwealth. The 1850 Constitution was drafted in the midst of the conflicts over slavery. Pro-slavery factions dominated the convention proceedings and were successful in incorporating a significant number of changes into the state's fundamental law. In the Bill of Rights to the 1850 Constitution, slave property was given added protection by a provision that slaves and their offspring should remain in the state, and that ministers of religion, long under suspicion as anti-slavery agitators, could not hold the office of governor or seats in the General Assembly. The authors of the Third Constitution were not only pro-slavery, they were also resentful of the broad power granted to the General Assembly by previous constitutions. Therefore, the General Assembly was limited to biennial, instead of annual sessions, and its authority to enact special legislation was severely curtailed. Sessions were limited to 60 days, although they could be extended by a two-thirds vote of each chamber. A limitation of $500,000 was placed on the state's indebtedness. It should be borne in mind that in 1850 this amount was approximately 1 year's revenue receipts. This same limitation remains in the current Constitution, although general fund revenue receipts for the fiscal year 2001 to 2002 were $6.5 billion. Membership in the General Assembly was fixed at 100 in the House and 38 in the Senate, the same as in the present Constitution. Responsibility for public education was constitutionally recognized for the first time by the 1850 Constitution. It provided a fixed educational fund to be supported by taxation, and for a popularly elected superintendent of public instruction. In keeping with the prevailing Jacksonian philosophy regarding public office, all state and local officials, including judges, were made elective. The document also contained a lengthy article detailing the requirements and manner of election of Commonwealth and county attorneys, circuit and county clerks, sheriffs, coroners, jailers, assessors, surveyors, and constables. The dueling prohibition, still effective in Kentucky, appeared for the first time in the Third Constitution. Its appearance was probably due to the fact that the denunciation of the practice by the press and from the pulpit had not been effective in preventing men of distinction from being involved in such affairs of honor.
Thank you for viewing this history of the Kentucky Constitution. For more information, please see the following references. Citizen's Guide to the Kentucky Constitution by the Legislative Research Commission, available online. Or the book, The Kentucky State Constitution, by Robert M. Ireland, Oxford University Press.